Hello, hi, a very warm welcome to our Year 6 students and parents. This video is just from popular demand as I've gotten a lot of requests from students and parents as well, just asking for some general tips and recommendations and what you should be doing just a few days before the test. A lot of these checklists and things we would have discussed in the classes themselves. The idea here is just that it's a bit of light revision so that these concepts can just be at the forefront of your memory. I know it's a very limited amount of time until the test and there's only so much you can absorb, so we'll keep this as brief and actionable as we can.
Okay, so if we begin with a few techniques for how to approach the reading comprehension paper, let's start with the first text. So the first thing that stands out to me as soon as I look at this text is just the sheer length of it. Now, this is a very long piece of for the reading comprehension. I'm just very briefly glancing over it, and I can see that it's absolutely packed with lots of details. You have descriptions about people, you have descriptions about the setting, and that really necessitates a very clear approach of how you keep track of all the different things that are going on in this big writing piece. So the first thing is I always like to start off by looking at the title. Not that it will be relevant in every case, but sometimes the title can give you valuable clues about the the rest of the story or poem or comic or whatever it may be. So by doing this, or rather by mentioning this, hopefully it just has you guys thinking that it's something to do on the day of the test, as it may be useful and relevant. I'm not saying it will be in every instance. The second thing is, as I'm going through the text, now you have really not much choice but to actually read through this despite its length, but as you're reading through it, you should keep track of what's going on, right? You should have some notes in the margins over here, and that serves two purposes. Number one is you give yourself some sort of index, some sort of reference that you can go back to it and see, okay, exactly what was in this particular paragraph or in this particular sentence. That would be extremely useful for your small detail-based questions. The other reason for writing things in your margins is also to have some system of accountability so that you yourself know that you've actually read it and understood it properly, or this really targets the comprehension aspect of it. It's very easy to go into autopilot mode where you're just reading words without taking or processing any of it, but by writing things down in the margins over here, you force yourself to actually think about what it is that I'm actually reading. So just to give you an example of what that might look like, maybe I'm just reading the section over here. So for the first mile or two, the scenery was familiar through the girls' daily perambulation in crocodile formation. So over here, I'm just going to say walk, right? So this basically talks about the beginning of their hike, right, when they're going for their walk. That's just something to keep track of. Next, the passengers knew only too well, without bothering to look at, how the scraggy, stringy bark forest lined the road on either side. Over here, I might just write something like view, right? Or nature just describes what it is that they're seeing. Yeah, so things like the clump of wayside willows, the Crompton's whitewashed cottage. These are all things that they're just seeing along the way. Yeah, and then over here we get back to the high roads of history. So over here, I would definitely just make note of that and write history. In fact, it seems to delve quite a lot about historical things like the death of King George, Edward III, which they're going to study next term. So just to keep track of that aspect of it, I would just write history over here. Right. Over here in the next paragraph, at Mrs. Appleyard's college, right? And at the very beginning, I should have already underlined the words college. That also gives you some insight into the setting, right? So you might be thinking, okay, what exactly is it that I'm writing in the margins? Really anything that describes either the setting, the characters, right? The events, right? Anything that pertains or relates to these things are what I should be keeping track of in the margins. Again, just so you have some sort of index to track back to. Let's just look at an example of how that might be relevant to a question so you can see whether it's actually useful or not. Over here, it says, in which extract do people dislike spending time in natural surroundings? So if I've gone through it and talked about things like nature or the views that they see, then it should be much quicker for me to jump back into the text and actually see, okay, which part is talking about natural surroundings. Likewise, if I'm going through the different options in this question, right, in both extracts, the passengers, which of the following, yeah? And then I can see, okay, this one here is about stopping and having a snack. Does either of the paragraphs discuss that? Or either of the texts, I should say. Did either of the texts talk about experiencing some discomfort? So if I go through, and if I've done a good job in highlighting the experiences of the characters as they're going through their journeys and whatever they're doing in the text, then this question should be very doable, right? Likewise, if I look a little bit further down, over here, I see a question which is, how does the writer feel when the roller coaster comes into view? Now, there's two aspects of this, right? Obviously, the main question is how they're feeling, but then the other thing is, to facilitate you being able to go back and think about how the character's feeling, you need to understand which part of the text talks about the roller coaster coming into view in the first place, right? That is where this index comes in, because if, as I read through it, I was basically able to find that this is the text over here. This text is the one that talks about the theme parks, right? So I've highlighted the theme park concept over here. Anytime you see something that you think might be relevant or important, just underline it. It doesn't hurt. If you think it would be very important, then that's when you write it down in the margins. Again, the core things that I mentioned before, the events, the characters, the setting, those are the things you want to leave for the margin. And if you see them as they come up, you can just underline them. So as soon as, because given the fact that I've underlined theme parks, that means I can straight away go into the second extract and not waste my time looking through the first one again. Now, I know, again, it's tempting to just rely on your memory, but it doesn't take very much time to underline things at all. But it will save time if, in case you're met with a very big text, or if these two texts were a bit more similar than they are, which could happen on the day of the test, then you just want to make sure you have a system to cover your bases there. Next, moving on to the poem. And this is where the point I was making before about the title comes into play. So I really want to make sure that the very first thing I see is the title, which isn't hard because they've boldened it and made it into italics here. But in general, you want to start by looking at the title, because that is basically what will give you a clue about what you're going to be seeing in the rest of the text. So in this case, it says the fish. So I would be expecting a poem that is either directly about fishes, or it's about the seas, rivers, oceans, that sort of aquatic setting, or it might be a metaphor for something related to do with the fish. Regardless of which of these three things is, whether it's direct or indirect, I know that I'm immediately starting to think about fish. The other useful thing that you guys might find helpful in terms of your approach towards text in general is also just understanding what are the main question types that you can get asked. I know we've covered this in a previous talk, but just to give you guys a quick summary, there are a few different text question types that are very common. So the first one is your big picture style of questions, which all deal with you being able to summarize what you read. Extremely important for the thematic reading questions that come all the way at the end of the paper. We'll discuss it again as we get to it. But essentially, you should be able to summarize what you're reading. Otherwise, it shows that you haven't really understood it, in which case you're not going to do very well with the questions. So make sure that every time you read something, you're able to generate some sort of summary for it. You have your small details questions, and these often tend to be the most common question type. Not saying they're necessarily easy, but there's a lot of strategies that you can use for small details type questions. An example of this would be in the poem itself, where it talks about what lights up the water, or what is compared to an injured fan, or in the previous one when it mentions things like the wayside willow. These are all small detail type questions. Some quick strategies that might be helpful is oftentimes if it is a big text, then you can very quickly skim through the questions, right? Read the questions first, not in a lot of detail, but just a quick skim of the questions so that you can see, what are the main question types? Are there a lot of these small detail style questions? In which case you can just be mindful of them as you read through it. So if I read through it and I see something like, what lights up the water, then it just gets me in a frame of mind where I'm thinking, as I'm reading the poem, okay, I should be thinking about something that illuminates or lights up the water. And that way, as soon as I see it in the poem, I can just draw a big star next to it or something, right? Something to grab my attention. So try and scan through the questions briefly, and that's something that you would find useful. The other useful strategy is making sure that you actually read before and after the detail itself. So once I've found the detail that I'm looking for, maybe it's what lights up the water, I want to make sure that I read at least one or two sentences before that detail, as well as after the detail, because that basically gives you context. And context can obviously, how it's used determines its meaning, right? So the way it fits in with the things that happen before and after, and that can actually change your interpretation of the detail itself, and therefore the answer as well. So make sure you are reading before and after if it changes the way that it's interpreted. The other thing, other things are just generic tips for any multiple choice exam. You should be actively trying to eliminate answer choices. Right? So even in comprehension and actually thinking skills as well, generally there are about two options that you can eliminate with not a lot of effort. It should be fairly easy to eliminate. And then after that, if you're tossing up between two answers, firstly, you have a high chance of getting the question correct, right? You're probability has increased in terms of getting the question correct. But also you can rely on also keeping a tally of the amount of evidence there is for each of those answer choices. And that can also just push you towards a correct answer, especially in more ambiguous cases. Moving on to the other question types, before you would see a lot of things like vocab questions, what does this word mean? What's the synonym for this word? You'll also see a lot of literary techniques. For example, what's a technique used in, something is like an injured fan, which would be a simile. What's a technique used over here? And it might be a metaphor. Of course, the test has been moving more towards ability rather than knowledge. So more about how you use what you know rather than how much you know in the first place. So I'm not sure how many of these types of questions we will see. Of course, if you've done diligent practice for it and it does come up, I'm sure that would be helpful. But the other interesting question types are your inferences. And which is, of course, you making educated guesses about what could happen next, or what's a character doing in this setting, or why they're acting the way they do, and also any sort of metaphorical interpretations or understanding, right? So metaphorical interpretation. These are also some slightly more interesting question types. Generally with these ones, it does take a fair amount of time to work on, so I wouldn't worry too much about those questions at this stage, but just make sure that you're very careful with what it is that you're reading. And the other thing is, of course, is as you're annotating the text, keep note of several of the core features of any text. So most of your core text types, your short stories, poems, comics, they would have a very clear sense of what is the main idea, right? What's the main idea going on over here, or what's the main event if it's something that's actively happening, or even message in the case of texts that are trying to convey something beyond superficial events. Again, I always keep a track of the title and see how that ties in with the rest of the piece. You should also be actively thinking about emotions, both the emotions of the characters as well as the emotions of maybe the author and how they're trying to make you as the reader feel, the characters as well, obviously, who they are, how they act, how they behave, what happens to them in the story or comic. These are just general things that you should always draw attention to and always think about critically, and that will just help you with the questions themselves, especially more difficult questions dealing with things like inferences and metaphorical understanding as well. Okay, moving on to the cloze passage. So I guess one of the biggest changes to the test is, of course, the inclusion of this cloze passage section. There are a lot of different strategies that you can apply for cloze passages, but given that there's only a couple of days before the test, there's a few core ones that I want to draw your attention to. So the main thing that I want everyone to be thinking about is just what are the relationships that can exist between sentences within a paragraph? What are the relationships you can have, right, between different kinds of sentences in a paragraph? So if I'm looking through this cloze passage over here, just giving you guys some examples to go off this particular text, I think in a nutshell, I'll just go through the relationships first. Actually, there's probably three main overarching relationships, which, if I was to very succinctly summarize, the first one is basically where you're looking for links, right? So basically where one thing leads to another and you're trying to fill in the missing link. So these typically take the form of you have a sentence, then you have a blank, and then you have a sentence as well afterwards, right? So it's basically the blank that fits in between two sentences. And generally you expect there to be a relationship where A leads to B, which leads to C, right? So these are your linking types of relationships. A simplified example of this type of relationship would be something like, maybe somebody was running down the stairs, right? They were running down the stairs at full speed. That's the first sentence, right? Then you have a blank, right? And then afterwards, this person, they needed a lot of help. They were barely able to walk, and maybe they even had to go to hospital to check out their leg, right? That's your third sentence. So what would you expect to be the relationship between the two of them? The first thing that you have is someone that's running down the stairs at full speed. And then the last thing that you have is that they need medical attention, right? So the thing that seems to link it is the idea that they must have been hurt or injured in this process, right? So this one was they ran, right? Then over here, maybe they ended up in hospital, oops. And then the thing that kind of links them both is that they probably had a fall, right? Maybe they fell, maybe they heard something. So that's your classic, not your classic, that's your simplified version of a linking statement. Of course, the test is not quite that simple. So if I was to give you an example from this passage itself, I think the best one would probably be question 15 over here, right? So first thing that you start off with is that there's a group that's led by this professor, and they argue that the octopuses are highly developed and curious creatures, right? They're highly developed, they're curious, and they're sophisticated creatures, yeah? Then that's, your sentence A, so to speak, from the previous example, A. Then you have your gap, which is B. We don't know what this one is yet, right? And then you have C. We can see no reason why in the 21st century, this sophisticated and complex animal. Now, that basically should tell you that this is a linking type of relationship, because over here it says it's sophisticated and complex, and over here it also tells you more or less the same thing, right? So there must be a link there somewhere, and to do that, I keep reading for my, for further context. It says it should become the source of mass-produced food, right? So sentence A is dealing with how they are an advanced creature. Sentence C is dealing with how this advanced creature should not become the source of mass-produced food. So that means that sentence B should have something to do with causing some sort of harm to these creatures, right? Something that's negative that leads to a decreased number of these creatures, of octopuses. So that's why the best answer, if I scroll down and have a look, should be C. Farming them intensively would probably cause large numbers of deaths from stress. That's a classic example of a linking type relationship. Of course, with linking type relationships, there are two ways you can get that answer. Number one is to be mindful of the big kind of sequence of events. You start off with A, you look at C, and you wonder, okay, what could possibly be the scenario that links these two? Yeah. And then the second thing is, of course, paying attention to smaller details that can give you clues. In this case, the clue that I was able to associate to find that it's linking one is the fact that this sentence and this sentence has a common theme, the fact that they're important creatures. Right? The thing that links them is obviously this concept of this important creature dying out. So I need to find an answer that relates to that. So that's your first type of relationship. The second one, the first one was basically your link. Yeah. Your second one is basically your contrast. Yeah. So contrast is obviously when you have two sentences that are different to each other. You can have comparing, or you can have contrasting. But if I want to focus on the contrasting one, that's basically where you're looking for keywords like however, but, anything that seems to go against the grain. Now, this one is definitely a trickier question type because you do have to look through the options and there can be multiple explanations, which makes it a bit harder. But the first thing I would do to try and get these questions correct is look for keywords. So keywords such as but, however, although, etc. Right? So these words can basically hint to how these sentences work. Oftentimes you find them in isolation. So it might be something like a sentence and then a blank. So a completely formed sentence, then a blank afterwards. This is typically the pattern that you see for contrasting ones. Now, the best example for this one is actually a fairly tricky one. If I look down at question 20, right? This is a good example of a contrasting type of relationship, even though it doesn't seem that way straight away. So it says here, in terms of contrasting relationships, of course, it can be a simple thing like the boy was looking forward to playing outside, full stop. However, he was disappointed when it started raining. Right, something like that is a very simple type of contrasting relationship. Now, the test is not as simple as that. So instead, you're going to have to look for the bigger picture when you're thinking about, where is the contrast. So the classic example is, something like question 20. It says, companies in countries such as Australia, Japan, and Mexico have said they're hatching octopus eggs in captivity. Right, so this is, and of course, they'll be soon ready to sell farmed octopuses. So you can see that this is talking positively about octopus farming. Right? But then if you read on a bit further, it says the markets for the animals, so the developed countries I mentioned before, are areas where people are already well fed, right? They're delicacies and do not deserve to be the focus of farming. So this is a negative statement. One of them is in support of octopus farming. The next one is opposed to it, which means that question 20 should be something that is contrasting in nature, something that tips the balance between the good things and the bad things in terms of octopus farming. So when I look through my answer choices, the best one that fits that is something that has some sort of contrasting statement, which would either be B or F. Right? Now B, might this actually be the best way to protect the species over the long term? That it's, as a rhetorical question, it's kind of questioning the idea of octopus farming being a way of protecting them. That is not really the theme of how it's used over there, right? How it's used is basically octopus farming. Some countries are doing it. However, it's actually a bad thing, right? So since we're going in that order of this is actually not good, the best answer would be F over here. The case is weak. The case for octopus farming is weak. It's not a good thing. And then the final type of relationship, right? Bearing in mind that these are fairly simplified, but if I was to just focus on 3 types of relationships to get you guys thinking about how sentences might fit in, it would just be these 3. So the third one is an explanation, right? Something that explains what happened in a previous sentence, or is explaining what's going to happen next. So again, often you find these isolated like this. You have a sentence followed by a blank, or a blank followed by a sentence. Basic example would be something like, I did not like chocolate, full stop. It is very sweet and hurts my teeth, right? Something like that. So if I just said, I do not like chocolate, full stop, or, my favorite snack is ice cream, then that by itself it's very isolated. It doesn't give you a lot of information, and you need some sort of explanation to figure out the why, right? So that's your classic type of explanation question. So to give you guys an example, as I'm reading through the piece, I'm just looking over here. Okay, here's one that stands out. If I look at question 18, right, you just have a blank there, followed by a sentence afterwards, which says, this has made feeding them difficult and expensive. Just like my example before, if I just said, I don't like chocolate, then you're thinking, okay, well, why? Or if I said something like, it is a sweet and delicious snack, right? After having a blank, you'd be thinking, what are you talking about? What is a sweet and delicious snack? Or why on earth don't you like chocolate, right? So these kinds of situations demand an explanation. Question 18, of course, demands an explanation, or rather it is the explanation, something, and then this has made them feeding them difficult and expensive, right? That is the explanation. So I need to go back and find something that it is actually explaining in the first place, right? So if I look at the answer to question 18, which was, these efforts have founded because octopus larvae only eat live food, then that is something that actually has a clear explanation afterwards. So they only eat live food, right? Which makes feeding them difficult and expensive. There's a nice explanatory relationship there, which is why that was the best answer. So in summary of the approach towards these closed passages, as you're reading through it, I think the most important thing would be you do have a systematic, top-down approach when you're reading it, just like with any text, all right? You start from bottom, go top, and go down. The first paragraph I noticed by looking at this one that it, just plans. It seems to give you a lot of information about the core of the text, the main topic that they're dealing with, which is very helpful. Then the second paragraph, as I'm doing it, I would basically just read this entire paragraph, right? That gives me the context of the paragraph as a whole, and then go back and try and answer question 15. Yeah, go back and try and answer question 15, just preemptively write an answer. Remember, you can scribble as much as you like on the question booklet. Your final answer should be on your answer sheet, however, and then pretty much, progress through it that way. So read a paragraph, try and answer the question, read the next paragraph and try and answer the question, and so on and so forth. If there are questions that you're not sure about, it's perfectly okay to leave them blank, right? There's no harm at all in skipping a particular question, so that you can go back and see, what might be the best answer in the future. In fact, if you look at the video where I'm going through the a more detailed description of the correct answers, it's just a video that you can find on our YouTube channel, then you'll see that I've done exactly that for this particular clause passage. So it's perfectly okay to skip questions. And the other thing is, of course, make sure that you are crossing out the answer choices as you are confirming them. So if I've confirmed that I've got the answers over here, like A, I've filled in A, I filled in C, I filled in E, make sure you just cross them out. Or if, for example, you've crossed it out and you realize, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that, then of course put them back in, right? You can just write it up again, and that's okay. And then, if you write it out and go back and cross it, that's perfectly okay as well. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is just make sure you have a system for understanding which ones you have and haven't used, so that it helps as you get to the end to narrow down your answer choices. Okay, moving on to the very last text type. So this one is, as I said, it was basically a thematic reading exercise. So you have 4 extracts. All of them are centered on the one theme, in this case, dreams. As I mentioned in the other video as well, the most important thing when you're doing this particular text type is to be able to summarize what you read, right? Absolutely critical to write a brief summary of what you have read over here. And also to, just like we did in the very first text, to keep track of the small details as they come up, right? So with this one, I guess one of the details that I might one of the annotations I might make would be something like over here, right? I might just write gate, right? Just that simple, just write gate, or even just underline gate if it's just that small of a thing, yeah? Something like lodge was uninhabited, right? That might be something that's actually useful. So if you have a question that's asking which one basically deals with, you know, a house where there is no one there, or a big estate where there's no one there. These little clues that can, you know, help point you in the general direction. But the biggest and most important thing is that you have a clear summary. So how would I summarize this extract over here? Just, you know, very, this one is very much talking about someone's experiences, right? So it's very event driven. So I would just list out those events, right? So something like the person is dreaming, right? Visits, you know, it could be a house, it could be an estate, it could be a place, whatever you want, but just visits a certain house or place. I think as I'm reading it, I would definitely underline the word again, just to imply that they have already been to this place before, maybe when they're awake. Then they see a gate. The gate, okay? At first, they can't pass, right? They can't get through the gate. And then afterwards, I would just write magically fly, right? They just fly through the gates. And that's pretty much what happens from here until here. Then the next thing that you know, you might notice as well, a lot of it is you know, really very descriptive. It's talking about, you know, numerous different things that are happening here, but the core of it is that it looks different. So I would just write looks different. Okay, it looks different to the last time they saw it, and I've underlined the word again. And these are really the you know, most important things. Of course, you can always just keep track of the things that are happening as you're reading it. So maybe something like supernatural powers, that might be important. So the lodge was uninhabited, just in case it asks about whether, you know, somebody was in it or not. At first, I was puzzled. So if it asks about which one deals with you know, paragraph talking about this person's confusion, then this may be the one. Something about nature. And these are just, you know, little clues that I'm keeping track of as I'm reading it, but nothing that's as important as the overall summary that I've got over here. Just from this summary alone, that will help me pretty much get any of these questions that are relating to extract A. So looking through the questions. Okay, so I mean, of course, I'm just going to speed things up, assuming you guys have already seen the video going through the actual questions themselves and have attempted the paper yourself. You know, 23, the answer was A. Something that would be impossible in real life, well, that was given away by the fact that I wrote the word fly, right? So this person has supernatural sensations, like they can fly through the gate, right? That's why 23 is A, very simply. The other one that was A was 27. 27 was also A. And the giveaway is mentions a place that looked different in a dream from its appearance in the writer's memory. So we also took note of that as we were reading through it. So the fact that it looked different, right? So these are the giveaways that will very quickly help you get the answer. Now, you're not pressed for time when you're doing the comprehension paper, right? It's about 30 questions that you're doing in 40 minutes. I understand the closed passage will take a fair amount of time. The other ones, which are fairly big texts and have lots of questions, do require you to really, it will, I have no doubts that it should take up a fair amount of your time. With this particular text type, I would really focus on having a really, you know, detailed and thorough read of the extracts and a very good summary for them as I read through them. That will help me get through the questions fairly quickly, right? So you're better off investing time in actually writing out your summaries for these extracts, you know, underlining the details and reading it critically. That should be the thing that takes up a lot of time. Going through the questions themselves will be very quick once that's done. On that note, if we could take a few minutes just to quickly talk about time management. So this is extremely important as an element of exam technique in the first place. So time management is two things, right? Number one is knowing your various checkpoints for each of the subjects, so what you should have done within, you know, what unit of time. And just as important is basically how you should adjust for your time based on these checkpoints. So starting off by talking about the checkpoints themselves, this will depend on the subject. You have reading comprehension, maths, thinking skills, and writing. Reading comprehension, just a quick table there. Now, if this is the number of questions, and this is the total time that we have here, for each paper. So reading comprehension, of course, has 30 questions. This one's 35. This one is 40. The time is, sorry, not 30. It's 40 minutes for each of them, right? For each of these sections. I think the easiest way would be to pretty much split it into quarters, right? So just every 10 minutes, you should keep track of where you are, right? So generally every 10 minutes is the time that I personally have found works best. Of course, everyone's different. What I would really try and avoid is looking up at the clock every 10 seconds or every minute, because you'll waste so much time just looking at the clock that it's not a productive exercise at all. Just keep looking at it periodically until you notice that 10 minutes have gone by. And that's when you should stop and track and think about how many questions have you done. In fact, as soon as, with general exams that I've done before, as soon as they say, your time starts now, the first thing I do is, quickly go over the paper and just, pencil in, where I should be up to within each checkpoint. So in the case of something like thinking skills, which is 40 for 40, at the 10 question mark, I would just put a star. 20 questions, put a star, 30 questions, put a star, and then 40 questions, you should know where that is. It's the end of the paper, right? That helps me just, again, be wary of, at a glance, be wary of where I am in terms of time. So splitting it up into quarters means that, I'll just put another column here, means that my checkpoints for reading comprehension will be around 8 questions, right? So 8 times 4 is 32. If I've done 8 questions every 10 minutes, then that means that I'm doing pretty well for time. For maths, of course, every 10 minutes, I should have done around 9 questions, right? So 9 times 4 is 36, puts me at a slight edge there. And then thinking skills, again, that's obviously just 10 questions, right? So very easy to remember, 8, 9, 10. If you want to do what I did, as soon as they say you can start, quickly go over the paper, and for reading comprehension, just mark it every 8 questions. For mathematics, just mark it every 9 questions. And likewise for thinking skills, just put a star or a little clock face or something, just anything that helps you remember, okay, I should have covered this many questions. Keep looking up at the clock until it says 10 minutes, and then just note where you're up to. That's pretty much the checkpoints. Of course, the critical thing is knowing how to adjust your time accordingly once you realize that you haven't met a particular checkpoint, right? So let's say we are looking at something like mathematics. I know that in maths, my checkpoints come every 9 questions, right? So at the end of 10 minutes, I should have covered at least 9 questions. If I'm doing something, if I'm very quick, then it might mean that I actually have to slow down a little bit and just check my working out a bit more carefully, or at least not be quite so rushed. If you still have time left over at the end, that's fantastic. You can go back and check your work. Please don't sit idly. Every mark counts, and it counts a lot more in this year's paper than it's ever counted before. So you do need to go back and check your work very diligently if you have time left over, or if you spend a lot of time doing the question in the first place to make sure that you get it correct. That's okay, as long as you're doing it within this time frame of 10 minutes. Should be around 9 questions. Okay, let's say, however, after you've hit the 20-minute mark, so you're halfway through the time, you figure out that you've only done 15 questions, right? As opposed to having done the 18 questions that we initially planned for, right? So we've only done 15 rather than 18. Is this a cue for you to basically say, oh no, this is miserable, I'm terribly behind on time, I won't finish? Absolutely not. At the same time, don't get complacent and say, okay, it's only 3 questions. It depends on what the questions are that follow, right? If you get a series of questions that are very time consuming, things that you're not very confident and strong with, then you probably won't be able to make up this gap, right? This deficit in time management. So that's when you should basically just pause very briefly and think, all right, well, 20 minutes, 15 questions, I'm a little bit behind. Where should I be at the 30-minute mark? Well, ideally at the 30-minute mark, you should have been up to question 27. Again, this is one of the reasons, because I'm not able to calculate as quickly in the moment. And often you set into a pattern of tunnel vision when you walk into an exam and there's a bit of pressure, time pressure involved. So I always like to go back and actually just write out my checkpoints at the very beginning. It's very quick. All you're doing is just writing 3 different stars throughout the booklet. Shouldn't take you more than, say, 10 seconds to do it. And it will save you all these headaches when you're actually doing the calculation. But the point is that you think about, okay, well, right now I'm here at the 20-minute mark, and the next checkpoint is due at the 30-minute mark when I should have done about 27 questions. So in this time frame, I need to basically do 12 questions instead of 9. that equates to about 3 or 4 questions that you are going to have to rush through to try and meet this requirement. It doesn't mean that you rush through all of the questions to try and catch up, right? It doesn't mean that where you would have spent 1 minute on a question or a bit less than that on a question, you suddenly just only spend about 30 seconds and try and blitz through it as fast as you can. That way, you're given each question a half-baked attempt and you're actually increasing your chance of getting them all wrong. So don't do that. Instead, you basically want to play to your strengths. So before the test, all the time of preparation up until this moment, you should have been trying to work on your weaknesses, focusing on your weaknesses. On the day of the test, you should be trying to focus on your strengths. So as you're going through those 12 questions within the next 10 minutes, you should be playing to your strengths and thinking about which questions you've always been good at in the past, which concepts are very clear to you, and which questions ultimately are fairly simple questions. Of course, it will be disguised and hidden because you can have some questions that have a lot for you to read through, some questions which, they might not have a lot to read through, but they will consume a lot of time in the working out. So, as you're going through it, you should quickly discern, how would it be? But either way, don't rush through all the questions. Rush through the questions that you naturally find difficult or the questions that you've never been good at in the past. As far as I know, and from, looking through the website, every question is still only worth 1 mark. Right? Or that's not really true. What I mean is all the questions are worth the same, right? It's not like harder questions are weighted differently based on the information that's available at this stage. So don't rush through all the questions. Rush through the questions that you naturally find difficult or are not as good with, or things that just consume more time, because the chances of you getting them wrong were fairly high anyway. That is how you should be adjusting to your checkpoints. Okay, the next thing I want to very briefly talk about is the writing paper. So firstly, this is the sample question paper, and I presume it would be the same structure on the actual exam. So you have a question paper, and then you have your answer sheet, right? It says here, your answer must be written on the answer sheet provided. It means that it's a separate piece of paper in which you actually write the response. Don't write it on this page over here because none of that will actually be read, right? None of that gets submitted. This is purely just the question itself. So over here, of course, this is the stimulus. It says, write it on the separate answer sheet. I know that sounds fairly self-explanatory, but just so none of you are thinking about on the day, hey, why did they give us 2 pieces of paper? It's because one of them is your actual response. This one here is just the question by itself, right? You can scribble all you like on this question booklet. In fact, I would encourage you to scribble some sort of plan, some sort of approach towards it. Oftentimes the system that we've been recommending for these kinds of fact-based texts is Peel. So very briefly, it's actually mentioned in a lot of detail in the other video that we've posted earlier, but essentially you have a clear introduction, you have you have 3 different paragraphs, each dealing with a certain theme, and then you have your conclusion. Of course, this is a generic structure that works for pretty much all of your fact-based texts. You would have to adapt this according to the stimulus itself and the conventions of the stimulus as well. So over here, the text type it's an advice sheet, right? It is an advice sheet. So think carefully about the conventions of this particular text type. If it's something else like a letter, and of course there are many different types of letters. There's letters of recommendations, there's a letter to the editor, a letter to an authority, a letter to a friend. So make sure you're mindful of exactly what type of letter it is, and therefore what kinds of text conventions, right? So that in terms of the conventions, right? In terms of any text type, think about the conventions, which is just the way things are done. You specifically have the conventions of the text type, which usually just refers to the structure, right? What sort of structure are you going to follow? And then, of course, you have your language conventions as well. So is it a formal letter? Is it a letter that's written as a guide? Exactly what type of language conventions are you going to use? A lot of this is kind of knowledge-based, which you guys would have covered. I'm just saying that you have to be very mindful of them as you read it. In fact, as soon as you see the stimulus, you should immediately highlight the most important things of it. So the most important things in this particular stimulus are, of course, who you're writing it to. So 3 new students have arrived in your local area. Your teacher has asked you to write an advice sheet. So I've underlined 3 new students because that is my target audience. I'm also going to underline advice sheet, right? Because that's the actual text type. And then the other things that are a bit more subtle would be things like make them feel enthusiastic. So you need to basically try and persuade them, excite them, make them feel more enthusiastic about joining your school. And it also says write an advice sheet for new students about how to get on well in your school and local area, right? The school and the local area as well. Again, these are more about how to get on well and local area. These are more clues that will inform your writing piece on the whole. So make sure you underline all of these things and make sure that you go back and refer to them every now and then as you're writing, so that you've ticked off these boxes and covered them as much as possible. Another very important thing that I want to draw your attention to is if we look at the Department of Education NSW government website, specifically looking at the writing test section over here, there's a few key things that we should note as we're reading this briefing. So one of them is, of course, it consists of one set writing task. You have 30 minutes in which to write this. The test assesses the students' creativity of ideas. So make no mistake, you have about 15,000 students that are writing the test. You need to find some way of differentiating your ideas. So we always say, make sure that you think of ideas that are unique, right? Something that stands out from the crowd, and something that's mature, because generally that will stand out from the crowd of other year 6 students that are writing the exam, and also to assert that you have a much more clear view, and just something that is really an advanced writing piece. The other thing is it also tests your ability to write effectively for a purpose and audience. Now, this bit here is very important, right? To write effectively for a purpose and audience. Again, this was the point that I was saying before about being aware of conventions, right? So effectively for a purpose is, of course, the text convention. So what is the purpose of your text in the first place? Are you writing a letter to convince someone? Are you writing an essay to convince someone? Are you writing a descriptive piece to display something to someone else? Are you writing a guide so that someone is able to understand something a bit better, maybe understand your school a bit better? Are you writing a guide to make them feel enthusiastic? Exactly what is the purpose for which you are writing? These are the kinds of things that you should be mindful of when you're doing the planning, right? And of course, the audience as well. Who are you writing this piece towards, right? Who are you addressing to? In the case of something like fiction, you're addressing it to readers, and you need to be thinking about what it is that you're trying to convey, right? Are you trying to just tell a brilliant story? Are you trying to make them feel certain emotions? What is your purpose, and what is it that, how is this purpose related to the audience that you're writing it for? These are all things that you should be planning for. Of course, tests will also assess grammar, punctuation, spelling, and vocab, the style of your expression, right? These are things that have always been important, no different in this particular case. But the one thing that seems to stand out from the sample paper compared to previous years is where before we would encourage students to write either a creative or a persuasive. A creative or a persuasive. Persuasive, right? These are things that we generally encourage just because they match the stimulus the best in the previous years. Now it tended to be a lot more specific. So you saw that it was very specific in terms of who the audience was, right? The sample paper literally said that it was for students that had moved into the area and that you were writing a guide for them. Now, the fundamental writing principles and concepts we've learned before are still relevant here, as they always will be. We still think about writing broadly in terms of the content, which is what you're writing about, and the expression, which is how you do it, right? Even with a more specific text, and of course with the content, as I mentioned before, the ideas, of course, should be unique, they should be mature, they should be detailed, right? So you want well thought out ideas, which basically entails that you have plenty to talk about for each idea, right? So if you're going to basically be talking about your school, right, you want to pick aspects of the school for which you can include a lot of details about, not things that you would only write a few sentences about, right? Then it wouldn't yield a very good paragraph. In terms of expression, things that you should be doing, as with any writing piece, are of course you want to have unique. You want to incorporate a variety of vocab. You want to make sure that the syntax, grammar, punctuation, all of those things are fine, right? So I'll just say the technical aspects of it, right, should be sound. You basically want to think about the structure, right? Definitely think about the structure of the piece, right? And that structure will vary depending on the text type. I don't want to give you any ideas at this stage because it's so close, and you should have learned, the structure of the majority of core text types, but just make sure that you have a clear sense of structure. Generally, in the case of a fact-based text, as I mentioned before, you have your intro, your body paragraphs, and some sort of conclusion. For a letter, that could be a greetings, a sense of purpose, focusing on common themes. So in terms of the structure, I do want to mention this idea of themes. So generally thinking of two to three broad themes that form your body paragraphs, and within those themes you have your finer details, right? So detail 1, detail 2, and detail 3 within each body paragraph, right? These are the things that basically create a robust paragraph on the whole. Okay, and on that topic of structure, your introduction, right? This is where you really grab the reader's attention. We always say you should have a top-down, like a funnel approach, where you put the most important things towards the beginning of your writing piece and the least important thing towards the end, which means your intro is absolutely critical in terms of conveying your core message or how you want to do it as well. So make sure you leave them with a good impression in the introduction. Make sure that you're very clear in your introduction about what you are going to be talking about in the rest of the writing piece. And then the body paragraphs, basically, you want to include plenty of things like anecdotes, examples, right? Anecdotes, examples. You want to have, realistic or reasonable statistics. Definitely don't make things up. Some sort of core generalizations and understanding. Overall, you should definitely demonstrate an understanding of cause and effect within your sentences, within your topic sentences, how one thing will lead to something else, rather than just leaving it blank. So something along the lines of, our school has a very diverse community, which will mean that you will fit in quite nicely, which will mean that everyone is very welcoming of people from different areas, right? Some sort of actual effect for whatever it is that you're trying to say. If you want to make it really, really mature, then you can also start to think about other bits of evidence, thoughts, reasons, examples from your life, maybe even current affairs. Anything that's relevant should all be put into your body paragraph. One other thing I want to draw your attention to is going back to the front page for the sample paper, specifically this part over here, which says the task provides an opportunity to show how well you can select, develop, and organize ideas, right? Select, develop, and organize ideas and communicate them effectively. That, of course, links back to the previous idea of how your writing piece is ultimately a product of what you're saying, the content, and how you say it, the expression. But bearing in mind that the amount of space that you have to write is fairly limited. I think I saw it somewhere before where it said that they only provide you that answer sheet and nothing additional would be given. If that's the case, if you are only given 2 pieces of paper to write, then, and you do have this 30 minutes, then suddenly it means that how much you're able to write becomes very important. You might want to write something for, say, 1,000 words, but you don't have that kind of space, right? Let alone that kind of time. So you should be very careful with the ideas that you're selecting, the main things that you want to talk about. Don't waste words on things that are not relevant. So that really means that your planning time is extremely important, to the point that how I would manage my time in the writing piece is I would spend at least 3 minutes, right, to give yourself a good minimum of 3 minutes coming up with a really solid plan, right? Then I would spend about 5 minutes going through my introduction. Now, introduction should be roughly about 4 to 5 sentences, depending on the complexity of the intro. Start off with your point of view or your purpose, or any other convention that may be necessary. Maybe you need a greeting, a specific type of greeting in the case of a letter, right? So start off with those things. Then you basically have a series of sentences that go into what you're trying to write about. If you're able to link the sentences, that's even better, but you do want to introduce your main arguments or ideas or the things that you want to say early on in your introduction. And then if you have space left over, then you basically want to have some sort of context sentence, something that ties in what you're trying to say with the greater scheme of the text purpose, right? So that should take you about 5 minutes, about 1 minute per sentence, yeah? Then for each of your body paragraphs, even if you just write something like 6 to 7 sentences in each body paragraph, that will take you maybe about 6 to 7 minutes, right? Depending on the length of the body paragraph. Just to give you guys a bit more flexibility, I will write here 5 to 7 minutes, right, for your body paragraphs. As I mentioned, have your most important ideas, the ones where you can really stand apart from everyone else, and your most detailed body paragraphs first, and then have the less detailed, less important ones as your last ones. And then if I write 3 body paragraphs, which is not unreasonable given that it is a 30-minute time frame altogether, then in the end, I still have maybe about 3 minutes to go back and refine, edit, go back and check that I've included all the points that I want to include, and yeah, just a bit of buffer time as well in the end. So that's basically how I would organize my time. The conclusion, while it is necessary, is absolutely not that important. That can pretty much be very rushed in just about a minute. It's just a quick summary of things that you've already said, a quick sign off. That doesn't have to take very long at all. Even just 1 to 2 sentences should be sufficient. Okay, that was actually a very comprehensive summary of a few things that you should be mindful of before the test. Of course, other aspects, if you want to see some tips and tricks for maths or for thinking skills, you can go have a look through our video before, which covers the approach and strategy for each of the questions in the sample paper. I'm not saying that that is necessarily exactly what will come up on the day of the test, but it's the most that we can do beforehand to really understand what your approach should be. Of course, remember, as I said before, you worry about the things that you can control, not the things that are beyond your control. So having a clear approach and strategy towards different things is definitely within your reach. Spend the next few days just quickly, going back and watching those things and revising. Okay, what are the different types of, say, approaches or different types of questions you can have? If it comes to things like thinking skills, where you have so many different just write that down. Thinking skills, we have so many different new question types and things that you probably haven't seen before, then just start to think about, okay, what are the different tools I have, right? So maybe I can draw some diagrams, right? Some things that can help me understand the flow of reasoning, right? The flow of reasoning or the flow of logic, right? So you can understand, how one thing might lead to another thing, understand the relationship between cause and effect, understand the differences between causation and correlation. Think about how, if you have a series where, maybe A leads to C, via this intermediary of B, then what are the other factors you can have which can either strengthen this relationship, or another factor which could weaken this initial relationship? What are the different ways that things tie in with each other? Didn't do a very good job with that diagram there, right? So just give yourself little symbols like this to try and understand further points. And these things, while they're not strict recipes for this is how you should do the question, at least it will teach you a general approach, and it will keep you adaptable no matter what comes up. So definitely have a quick browse through those videos and just see what kinds of things have been covered before. It's just so you can be mindful of it in the lead up to the exam. Okay, in terms of just other general tips and things, I'm sure you've been told a lot of these before. I'm just going to explain to you one more time, just so that it stays at the front of your memory. So, make sure that you get plenty of sleep and rest the day before the exam. This is, a very easily overlooked element. A lot of people, of course, it's very natural and normal that you'd be, excited, maybe a bit nervous the night before. But even from now on, over the next couple of days, start sleeping at, a little bit earlier than you would normally sleep at, so you can fall into that routine. Hopefully, on the day of the test, if you do, go to bed a bit earlier and you get past the jitters and things like that, you still get enough rest before the exam itself. At the same time, make sure that you arrive early to the exam venue. Right? Have a look at your exam briefing, the test authority letter. Make sure that is printed out, or authority letter. Without that, you can't attend the venue. So make sure you have that printed and ready to go, and do have a read through that as well. That will give you all the information. I would definitely arrive a little bit earlier than it tells you to arrive at. Not that it means that you can go in, but it's just to account for different things like, traffic. A lot of times, traffic can just pan out unexpected. Everyone will be, commuting to this destination. It won't be, for most students, it's at the local high school. So, you'll have a large number of students that are all traveling to this local high school, and that means that you have more traffic than expected. So please do make sure that you plan ahead, plan to arrive early. Also be mindful of the weather, right? I checked the forecast the other day and it mentioned that Thursday might be a bit rainy. So that means it's going to be a bit cold. Make sure that you dress in layers so that you stay warm. You don't want to be, the key here is you want to avoid distractions, right? So if you get distracted by something like maybe you didn't eat enough in the morning, maybe you're feeling very cold, or maybe you dressed too warm for the particular weather, maybe you arrived a little bit late or not as early as you wanted to, you're in a new environment and you don't really know what's going on. These are all things that would just contribute to distractions, right? So avoid distractions, right? Anything that can, make you lose your concentration and focus, you should think about it and, avoid that beforehand. Another thing that's a very common distraction is basically how you spend your break time. Okay. Now, I'm not going to say go, avoid everyone, don't talk to anyone. That's pretty natural and it's normal. And sometimes talking to your friends, if you're close to them, will actually put you a little bit more at ease. The thing I would try and avoid is basically, going into the nitty gritty of all the questions and really trying to think, okay, was this the correct answer? Was that the correct answer? All that's going to do is just get you more anxious. At the end of the day, every single paper that you do is a fresh start. If you found that you did the reading comprehension paper at the very beginning and it went terribly, it was completely unexpected, it was very difficult, and even though you're normally good at reading, this was something that was just completely out of the blue and you just really didn't do as well as you thought you would, you gave it your best shot, forget about it. The next paper is your mathematical reasoning paper. It's a fresh start, right? Regardless of how you went with maths before, even if that was, let's just say that's one of your weaker areas, it doesn't matter because it's a completely new day. It's a completely new test, right? And it's a fresh start. So just give yourself a bit of a reset after every paper. During the break time, don't get into conversations that are likely to cause anxiety. At the same time, don't go around running everywhere and depriving yourself of energy for the next test. Just stay balanced and stay in a good frame of mind throughout. Of course, the other things that are often discussed is food, water. Really gets back to the idea of using common sense to avoid distraction. So in terms of food, make sure you eat enough on the morning of the test. You don't want to go hungry. It is a fairly, of course they give you breaks in between, but the authority letter basically says that you should pack a sufficient snack for the big break that you get. Now that big break, depending on what time you have breakfast and how early you get to the venue, might be for a while, might be for a couple of hours. So make sure that you've eaten enough that you're not going to be distracted by hunger in those couple of hours. Generally, you won't be because you're fairly excited by the prospect of doing the test, but on the flip side, also avoiding eating too much. Essentially, try and stick to your routines, right? Try and stick to your routines. There's a lot of safety, security, stability, and peace of mind when following your routine. So just do that. Don't eat anything out of the ordinary. In terms of water, basically, if it's like 1 hour before the test, that's when you should start taking small sips of water so that your bladder doesn't distract you from the paper itself, and that's really the goal here. So avoid any sort of distractions, avoid anything that's outside of your routine. Make sure you get plenty of rest, have a good read of the authority letter and have that printed out, and make sure that you've accounted for things like weather and traffic so that you arrive early. Dress in layers so that if you're too warm, you can always remove layers, just be wary that it might actually be a bit raining on the day of the exam, and yeah, otherwise good luck with all of that.
Okay, and I just want to end with a final note about the, just to give you a greater perspective about the test and what it means and the scores and things like that. At the end of the day, you as an individual, as a child, are much more than a score. Of course, the test is, the culmination of your efforts and all the, hard work you've been able to put in. But the most important thing is that you've proved to yourself, and of course to, those who care about you as well, that you're capable of actually pushing yourself. The idea here is that, we learn a few concepts, we're able to apply that in a test environment, and if that goes well, then fantastic. You will be in an environment, hopefully with like-minded peers. And if not, then that's okay. This is not the end of your secondary education. It's actually just the beginning of it, and the opportunities you get from all of this, no doubts, will keep you progressing throughout life. So give it your best shot. I really do hope that you all do fantastically in the test and do as well as you hope that you do. But at the end of the day, as I always tell everyone, you should only worry about the things that you can control. So things like your score, your mark, your rank, how the people around you did, what kinds of conversations are taking place between people during those break times. None of that is material. The things that you can control are make sure you get a good night's rest before the exam, make sure that you are in a positive frame of mind on the day of the exam, make sure that you go into it and you're able to actively think about the concepts that you've learned, actively think about how to apply those concepts within the framework of the questions in front of you, that you're in the right frame of mind throughout the exam. Planning your approach, these are the things that you can control and should be worrying about. Time management, as I mentioned before, is absolutely critical, but don't be thinking about the past and all the mistakes that you've made before. None of that is material anymore, and otherwise just give it your best shot, and I wish you all the very best of luck.